My dad gave me his welder when I moved into this house and he saw the workshop that the house came with. I don't think the welder had seen much use since maybe the late 1980s, but when he visited another time I got him to show me how it worked. I wanted to learn how to use it, but aside from a couple of quick fixes, I didn't really have any particular projects in mind to try and learn it to use. Particularly through the efforts of fitting Lily's bakery out though, I began wondering how hard welding stainless steel was. I asked the internet and it told me that arc welding was actually quite good for welding stainless steel. You just had to make sure everything was clean and to use the right electrodes. So I had a tab open on my computer for months, noting the right kind of electrode, and then the next time I was ordering from a metal supplier, I got a couple of scraps of stainless steel so I could begin practicing. I put off practicing for ages and ages, but I guess I was kind of inspired by the terrifying welding that happened to put the steel frame up for our conservatory. And because I'd broken my wrist while that project was happening, I couldn't really do any heavy lifting to move it forward, so eventually I decided it would be a good opportunity to start practicing some welding. I didn't really know what I was doing. I basically turned the welder down to its lowest setting and then gradually cranked it up until I could get a spark and an arc going. I was actually really surprised with the results. My practice pieces looked better than I expected, so I was quite inspired to give it a go on a proper project. The smallest project that I had in mind was a trolley for Lily's mixer in her bakery. I made her this temporary wooden one out of some scraps just after she got the mixer, so we could make sure the trolley was the right size and height for her desired use case. She made some inquiries to get the trolley remade out of stainless steel, but they all seemed to fizzle out a little bit, and so a couple of years later, that gave me the excuse to try and weld something together myself. I ordered enough metal to make the frame. The places on the internet that sell this box section are willing to cut it all down for you, and that made the job so much easier for me. I used a clean flat disc to bevel all of the edges that I was going to butt weld together, which also gave me a little bit of space for the weld to sink into and penetrate, hopefully getting a good weld. I was effectively just making a big box frame, so I whipped up a template for the end pieces that I could clamp around and weld it all together. I welded one side together, and when I flipped it over I did have to clamp it down a little bit.
Oh man, it's warped.
So I could squeeze it back into square. But it welded together really nicely, and I was shocked at how strong these rectangles were, even after I'd ground the welds flat. With the two ends together I could start seeing what I was going for, and because it went so well so quickly, I started getting a little bit overconfident with welding them together. So I got a little bit sloppy with my clamping, and the first two horizontal bars I welded to the end frames ended up warping and bending a little bit more than I would have liked. I made an effort to clamp them more thoroughly on the next two, and they came out much more square. And then when I was welding it all together, I did manage to bend them back into the position that I wanted, getting it back into square enough. I also managed to add a little bit of character to my retrimmed workbench while I was at it. With the box all welded together, it seemed really strong, so I dared test it with my own body weight, and it laughed at me at how strong it was. It was really shocking. From there, the next thing to do was add the surface that goes on top of the box that the mixer will sit on. I knew this was going to be harder because the material was thinner, but at least I had some material to work with already, because I had the piece of metal that I cut out when I was fabricating the sink for Lily's bakery. I did need to trim it down a little bit, so I tried using a scrap of wood as a guide to cut it with the angle grinder, and I was surprised at how slow it was to cut. Although it wasn't quite as inaccurate as I thought it was going to be by doing it by hand with an angle grinder. I ended up doing the other cuts with that blade that I got for the circular saw, and this time cutting with it went really fast. I'm not really sure why. It wasn't particularly neat, but it was about as accurate as the angle grinder cut was. It was just a lot faster, which worked out for me. The thin stock was really difficult. I was so worried about blowing through it, I ended up just tacking it into place in a couple of spots, which was more than enough to hold it in place. And after a couple of smaller tests on one of the corners, I decided I didn't want to risk blowing through it, and left the tacks as good enough once they were ground down. I decided now was the time to invest in a Dremel, a tool that I always thought I should have had but never really saw a use case for. But I got it for this project to try and help me grind out some of my bad welds on the inner sides of the joints. I didn't have enough sheet stainless left over to do the shelf on the bottom, so I had to order that. But before I ordered that, I read about what I could do to try and make my life a little bit better trying to weld with thinner material. I'd read that thinner rods would be better for thinner material, so I ordered a pack of them. And I also read that heating the electrodes would help you get a better spark, which was interesting because I discovered through my own testing that I could get a better weld going if I started the new rod on a scrap of metal before moving on to my actual production piece. The thinner rods were an absolute nightmare for an amateur like me. I just couldn't get an arc going for the life of me. I could barely get them to spark, but because they were so thin they were really wobbly and really difficult to hold steadily. By the time my new sheet for the lower shelf arrived, I'd given up on the thinner sticks and decided I would just move back to the rods that I was using before to tack it all together. I had to cut corners out of the sheet to be able to slot it in around the frame, but with a little help from a clamp it dropped in just fine and I tacked it all together again. This trolley was getting closer and closer to finished. The last thing I had to do was to put some plates on the bottom of it to attach the casters to. I'd ordered these squares of 5mm plate for the job, and my idea was to drill and tap them so I could bolt the casters straight to them. I ground down the rough cut edges that they came with and cleaned up a little bit the scale that was on them. And then I marked one of them up for the caster mounts, and set up a convoluted jig on the old Wolf pillar drill to try and start drilling the holes. This ended up being far too inaccurate. It was a bit of a disaster, and old Wolfgang had no speed control either, so I started wondering if this was a really bad idea. I decided I'd try drilling the next hole with my hand drill, and this took forever. I think it took 7 minutes to do just a pilot hole, and I had 16 of these holes to drill. I was really frustrated with how this was going, so I decided that I'd better step away from the workshop for the day, and I slept on it and came back to the job in the morning. I realised I was trying to be too clever before, so I just marked up my target holes with a centre punch and returned to the Wolf pillar drill as the best idea, this time adding some oil to try and keep it a bit cooler. I did eventually have much more luck doing it this way, and I got all of my holes drilled and was ready for the next challenge, which was tapping the holes. This ended up being the most difficult part of the project by far. I don't think I've ever tapped a hole in metal before, and it was really difficult going. I didn't even get through my first hole before I ended up snapping the tap, which was really frustrating, but I was quite proud of myself for the series of clamps that I managed to use to rescue the situation and get the tap out of my workpiece. I managed to break I think 2 more taps trying to do this, but after sleeping on it again and reading up about the technique, I learned that my problem was probably getting too much heat into the steel. So I moved on to using a proper tapping lube and rotating my way through all of the holes that I was trying to tap to not get the workpiece too hot at any time. And it ended up going so much better once I knew what I was doing.
Woohoo!
So now I had all of the plates tapped, I needed to make sure the bolts could fit all the way through to hold the casters onto the plates. This was alright on 2 of the corners of the plates, but on the other 2 corners, the holes were above the box section that made the frame up, so I got the hand drill out and tried drilling some relief holes into them, but it just wasn't cutting through again, so I had to abandon that idea. I came up with a different solution, which was to just angle grind the bolts on those 2 corners of each plate shorter, so they wouldn't go all the way through the plate, but would still hold the caster in plenty secure. This ended up working really well, and I could finally weld the plates to the bottom of my trolley. It was a lot easier welding these with this thicker material. I was much less worried about blowing through. My welds still weren't elegant by any imagination, but they were definitely really strong again, and suddenly the project was looking pretty much done. There was just a little bit of cleanup to do, and I'd been giving the whole thing a periodic sanding with my belt sander to try and keep all of the brush lines relatively straight. And then it was looking pretty much finished. I decided I'd better try and take my weight on it again, and was really pleased at how easily it seemed to handle it. I was so proud that I'd managed to make this and it was working so well, even if it wasn't particularly attractive. It is quite ugly if you look at it too close, but it's also really strong, which I guess means it functions very well. Welding has a really strange learning curve. I'm not really sure how I'd draw it. There's obviously the first bump of the curve, which is learning how it even works at all, but I found it surprisingly quick, considering this was my first welding project, to get to something that was really strong. But I also imagine it would take an incredible amount of practice to start getting really clean, tidy welds that you would be proud putting on the internet. I find it hard to motivate myself to practice without an actual project in mind. So even though I did start with a couple of scraps on this project, I was really only able to motivate myself to do it with the larger goal of the whole trolley in mind. I do have a few other ideas of things that I'd like to make out of stainless steel though, both in the bakery and out, and I can definitely see myself getting better at it with more practice. Being an ambient trolley in the bakery is not exactly a marine environment, but I will keep an eye on it and see how it holds up over the next few months before I think about embarking on another stainless steel project, because I know my workshop wasn't exactly particularly clean while working on my project. Regardless of how ugly it is, I am very proud of it though. It looks much more at home in the bakery than the wood ever did, and it's probably a bit easier to keep clean as well. So maybe I'll be able to motivate myself to put in a bit more practice and revisit the project again sometime in the future. Keep it real.